Welcome back. Today, we've got an absolutely fascinating explainer lined up for you. We're going to dive into a roughly 50-year period that, well, literally rewired the globe. We're talking about the deeply intertwined forces of the Cold War and decolonization. If you want to understand the modern world, how borders were drawn, how ideologies clashed, and how brand new nations forged their identities, this right here is the absolute foundation. We're going to break down the clear, structured facts you need to truly grasp this massive, complex era. So let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to digest this 50-year chunk of history by breaking it into four main chapters. First, the global ideological divide. Second, decolonization and new nations. Third, the rise of nonviolent resistance. And finally, number 4, the end of the Cold War. Let's go.
Chapter 1. The Global Ideological Divide. To understand exactly where this all starts, we have to rewind to the immediate aftermath of World War II. Back in 1945, at the Yalta Conference, leaders like Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were actually collaborating. But as we know, that alliance didn't last long at all. The end of the war permanently altered the entire global balance of power. It turned former allies into bitter enemies almost overnight. The conceptual differences between these emerging superpowers became incredibly polarizing, creating what famously became known as the Iron Curtain. Now, it wasn't a physical wall at first, right? It was this deep, sharp, ideological division. Countries across the globe were gradually drawn to one side or the other, fundamentally splitting the world right down the middle. So, the crucial point is understanding exactly what lay on either side of that curtain. On one hand, you had capitalism. Championed by the United States and the NATO alliance, this bloc extolled the virtues of democracy and the free market. Opposing them was communism. Represented by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, these nations turned to authoritarian governments and relied on strong top-down leadership to accomplish their goals. We're literally looking at two fundamentally opposing ways of organizing human society. Now, despite being incredibly bitter enemies, the US and the USSR stopped short of declaring war directly on one another, and thank goodness, because a direct war between two nuclear-armed superpowers would have been absolutely catastrophic. Instead, they engaged in proxy wars. Basically, they fought their battles in post-colonial locations all around the world, places that were just distant enough to keep the broader Cold War from turning hot.
Chapter 2. Decolonization and New Nations.
So while the superpowers were playing this massive global chess game, new nations were grappling with their own identities on a much more micro level. During this era, a really powerful spark of nationalism led dozens of nations to finally seek independence. But here's the catch. Once independent, they were almost immediately forced to choose an alignment, capitalist or communist. Many Asian countries, like China, embraced communism. Chinese communists seized power and implemented the Great Leap Forward to nationalize their entire economy. And this communist promise of land distribution and research sharing, it held a really strong appeal across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Government structures in these newly independent states often developed a national identity that closely aligned with whichever superpower sponsored their specific ideological position.
But, we can't just talk about decolonization as some dry academic concept. The creation of these many new states carried a devastatingly heavy human cost. We use the term decolonization displacement to describe this. It refers to the severe violence, massive population displacement, and forced resettlement that frequently accompanied the redrawing of borders and the messy birth of these newly independent states. And this brilliantly illustrates the human scale of that massive displacement. Just imagine these special trains, heavily crowded with people literally sitting shoulder to shoulder on the roofs and hanging out the windows. These were used to transport refugees in and out of Pakistan after the area gained its independence from Britain. It really grounds our geopolitical theory in a stark human reality. Millions of everyday people were uprooted from their homes simply because the map of the world was being rapidly redrawn. Moving on to Chapter 3, the rise of nonviolent resistance. Amidst all these proxy wars and massive global displacement, local populations definitely weren't just sitting passively by. They actively challenged established power structures, but the methods they used evolved dramatically. Historically, opposing colonization usually meant traditional military resistance. Think of the Haitian or French revolutions, where local populations would rise up against a colonial government using physical military strength. But the 20th century, it saw a major shift. The Cold War era witnessed a huge proliferation of nonviolent methods. This was a profound change in political strategy, proving that established entrenched structures could actually be challenged without resorting to traditional warfare.
Let's look at two absolute champions of this approach. First up, Mohandas Gandhi, who successfully orchestrated India's complete independence from British colonial rule. Entirely without military warfare, it's a staggering historical achievement. Next, Nelson Mandela. He utilized a similarly non-violent model to help South Africa navigate the immense challenges of its colonial past and address its new obligations as a fully independent nation. These leaders proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that nonviolent political resistance was incredibly effective at resolving some of the most deeply entrenched political conflicts of the 20th century.
And finally, Chapter 4, the end of the Cold War. Let's move to and see how this builds. Having explored the grassroots resistance and the birth of new nations, we need to widen our narrative hourglass back out to the global stage. So, how did this 50-year bipolar world system finally collapse? Well, the USSR officially dissolved in 1991, driven by a wild domino effect of compounding internal and external pressures. First, look at the Soviet Union's domestic situation. They faced the unimaginably high cost of trying to engage in a nuclear arms race without having the industrial base to actually support it. It just began to severely wear the country down. Second, there was the failed invasion of Afghanistan, which proved to be both highly costly and, frankly, politically embarrassing. And third, on the US side, political leaders gradually shifted their strategy. Instead of simply trying to contain Soviet influence, American leadership became more interested in actively forming diplomatic links with the Soviet Union.
Now, what's really interesting about this moment is how it perfectly captures the physical dismantling of that Iron Curtain we talked about at the very beginning. In 1989, massive crowds stood right on top of the Berlin Wall, holding signs of peace and actively bringing down the physical barrier that had divided East and West for decades. This event really symbolized the impending end of the Soviet Union. And it perfectly bookends our entire explainer today, going from drawing an ideological curtain to literally tearing down a concrete wall.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty big question to ponder. With the Cold War over, did the world truly unite, or did we just find new ways to divide ourselves? We've seen how decolonization birthed entirely new nations and how incredibly rigid ideological lines split the globe for half a century. While the Iron Curtain fell, understanding this history is absolutely crucial to understanding the geopolitical lines that are still drawn today. So keep asking questions, keep studying the history behind the headlines, and hey, thank you so much for learning with me today.